Hello and welcome to WAVE's webinar session. My name is Lena Piskernik, Step Up Campaign Assistant in the WAVE office in Vienna. I will be assisting today with the technical aspects, while Kat Višnar, Step Up Campaign Coordinator, will be presenting the topic. We would like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today, and we hope that the session today can be mutually beneficial and can support your work through knowledge sharing and reflection. As you can see from your screen, the session is entitled Tough Times, Alternative Sustainability Strategies. We are planning to run the session from 13 to 14 o'clock, depending on the time we spend answering questions and listening to audience input. We may end sooner than 14 o'clock. Now I would like to move on to the agenda to show you how we will try to divide the time of our session. In a short while, I will do a small briefing about the webinar, mainly discussing the technical aspects for participants and general information about the goal and purpose as well as method of this webinar session. Then I will shortly go through some housekeeping rules about how to take part in the webinar so that we can stay organized and so that all of us can get the most out of it. Kat and I will then introduce ourselves to you. Following this, for about 30 minutes, we would like to go through the topic of today's webinar session. I would like to go through some technical aspects of this webinar. As you may be aware, as a participant joining the webinar, you are automatically muted. We will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation and beginning of questions and comments part of the webinar. Additionally, Kat and I cannot see you even if you have your webcam on. In case something does not work, close out of the webinar and log in again by clicking the link in your registration confirmation email. And for your information, the webinar is being recorded. Taking part in the webinar is relatively simple and hopefully enjoyable. First, have a listen to the presentation of the topics to prepare for subsequent discussion. During the presentation of the topic, if any questions arise, please write any questions to the facilitators in the questions pane. Facilitators will answer questions at the end when we start the questions discussion part of the webinar. During the questions and discussion, I am not able to unmute everyone so that we can have a lively chat. I can only unmute individual participants, so please raise your electronic hand for the facilitator to invite your question or contribution to the discussion. And last but never the least, enjoy. So let me introduce myself. I am Lena, Step Up Campaign Assistant at the WAVE office in Vienna. I am in charge of organizing the webinars for the WAVE office, and I'm also the controller of the technical aspects of this webinar. And now, I will let Kat introduce herself and begin the presentation.
Hello, hello, hello. Katarina Višnar here. I'm the coordinator of the Step Up campaign and the presenter of this webinar, which I hope you will find interesting. For this webinar, I've decided to go through some historical examples of campaigns which will hopefully give you more ideas and broaden your horizons about what is possible for you also to do with your campaigns and your organizing and your work. I will start with a brief overview of the current political situation in the world. Today, we are witnessing many of the yesterday's values of the progressive democratic world coming under threat. As a part of the feminist movement, we are witnessing the easiness with which conservative, right-wing politicians and governments organize against women's rights and claim that women's organizations are threats to families. The consequence? The sheer existence of women's organizations comes into question, while violence against women and children threatens to escalate. We of course know that actually the opposite is true and that progressive women's organizations as well as feminism are actually the future. However, does the current status quo and the prospects cause you worries? If they do, if you are worried, to me you seem to be rightly so. Why? One of the reasons may be that we are aware that our contemporary social movements do not have anywhere close to the capacity needed for sustained challenges to the power structures that they are up against, at least regarding the issues where change will threaten capital in the increasingly plutocratic order. Further, social movements want to challenge power with truth. We all do. We may be right, but yet we remain disappointed because power does not seem to be much concerned with our truth. What the power is concerned with is power. Also, we see that right-wing movements seem to be better prepared for what is coming. We see that they have learned more lessons of political strategy from the civil rights movement than the left has. And on the left, there is the liberal left, which has professionalized and created a wide range of single-issue non-profits, their membership often being passive and useful mostly for donations. That is, if the organizations even had members at all, let alone chapters where members get to meet and work face-to-face. Similarly weakened is the radical left. In many ways, it has imploded, contracted, and alienated themselves from the basis. We see some of the most idealistic and collectively minded young people in society removing themselves voluntarily from the institutions and social networks that they were organically positioned to influence and contest. The framework that activism occupies became a special space, an activity disembedded from the day-to-day lives, cultural spaces, and workplaces of most people in society. This means that activists are likely to check their activism at the door when entering non-activist spheres, and all of that is not good. More generally, in the words of Immanuel Wallerstein, the global left have not yet been willing to accept that the struggle between them and the global right is a class struggle, and that this should be made explicit. Quoting Wallerstein, "In the ongoing structural crisis of the modern world, which began in the 70s and will probably last for another 20 to 40 years, the issue is not the reform of capitalism, but its successor system. If the global left is to win that battle, it must solidly ally the anti-austerity forces with the multicultural forces. Only recognizing that both groups represent the same bottom 80% of the world's population makes it likely that they can win out. They need to struggle against the top 1% and seek to attract the remaining 19% to their side. That is exactly what one means by a class struggle." End quote. So how do movements build themselves to challenge power? We know that social movements need strategy, and then the strategy requires discipline. If we are to contest power, our grassroots organizations and social movements must also have more than a vision of a better world. They need some sense of how to get there. Because knowledge of what is wrong with the social system and knowledge of how to change the system are two completely different categories of knowledge. So what I'm asking myself and yourself is, are we equipped with this knowledge? In today's webinar, I'm going to use examples, stories to deepen our knowledge and widen our horizons about what historical alternatives can offer as answers and as an inspiration to the demands of our times. Two of these examples are more recent ones. I'm going to start with an extremely clever and unique hybrid of different strategies, the Otpor movement of Serbia, then continue with a summary of the struggle for marriage equality in the USA, and then go to one of the most brilliant political challenges of the 20th century, imagined and led by Mahatma Gandhi. It's called the Salt March. In Serbia in the 1990s, many believed that Slobodan Milošević could not be ousted. But right there, a youth-based group called Otpor, which means resistance, became a very important catalyst in bringing together various aspects of civil society. Using the tools of civil resistance, Otpor was able to do a number of important things in helping spur the mass uprising against Milošević. In 2000, when Milošević tried to skew a presidential election, he met with some 500,000 people who rallied, who carried out strikes throughout the country. These actions ultimately and finally forced him out. Otpor managed to bring together different organizing traditions, using some of the skills of structure-based organizations and mass protest on the other. Many of the students who formed Otpor were previously frustrated by the inefficiency of the movements of uprising. So they were interested in building a model of non-violent action that could be sustained over a longer period of time. They were clever enough to also recognize the potential of the oppositional political parties' membership. They saw how these structures could be useful in helping them reach different groups in society, though they saw political parties themselves as rigid, incapable of looking beyond their narrow interest and harnessing the power of mass movement. Otpor established themselves as a movement that used humor, designing all sorts of creative stunts to mock the regime and show the people that resistance was possible. But at the same time, they were very good at absorbing the energy that they created and generated. Otpor's most distinctive innovation involved a new type of organization they created, disruptive yet highly strategic, decentralized yet carefully structured. Their combination of traits is usually found in different schools of organizing. That has been the source of confusion for many observers who have been unsure how to classify Otpor. Rather than waiting around for the next big bang that could send people into the streets, Otpor began building a network with the ability to engineer its own spikes of unrest. Their start was small, but they ended with a revolt of historic proportions. They had a firm decision that they should commit to using only non-violent tactics. They were incredibly conscious about their looks and their message. They were able to take ideas from corporate marketing campaigns to allow their message to reach people who were otherwise indifferent to the typical political advertisements of the opposition parties. The earliest and likely most iconic of these symbols was Otpor's logo, a clenched fist. The logo was easy to paint onto walls with a stencil or to slap onto street signs as a sticker. It quickly began appearing throughout the country, sometimes accompanied by a single word Otpor, and people started wearing it on t-shirts. Otpor carried out hundreds of small actions. The group's most famous slogans, for example, "It's time," were not even explicit in naming their target. They did not need to be. Otpor decided that the movement would have no figure personalities, so nobody could become media celebrities, but also authorities could not imprison or blackmail anyone if they wanted to shut down the group. That does not mean that Otpor had no leaders. Of course it had. But they constantly rotated official spokespeople and were very careful to avoid developing a cult of personality around any individual. Otpor created a structure that could allow for local teams of activists to act independently. They succeeded in creating a cohesive movement identity among tens of thousands of Serbians. Two key tools it used to achieve this were front-loading and mass training. Front-loading was a means of creating well-defined norms and practices for the movement without a direct, heavy-handed oversight, so typical of the hierarchical political parties. The reason Otpor leaders could give people freedom and still be confident they would take action consistent with the goals and messaging of the larger effort was that they had front-loaded the guidelines of the movement. They created a sort of DNA that was replicated as Otpor chapters spread. A clear strategy, a brand and a vision of what they wanted to accomplish. They had a distinct set of tactics that chapters and people could pick up and use, and well-defined boundaries within which local teams expressed their independence. The way they engaged new people was mass training, and this is also very interesting. Otpor established an extensive series of mass trainings which allowed them to quickly, usually within 5 working days of a week, engage new supporters. Those weekly courses took around 10 hours and were designed to empower participants to independently start operating in their own autonomous local chapters. Within these 10 hours, new members were able to internalize the movement's DNA. They were able to go from being total outsiders to becoming team leaders in their towns. And the training process was exponential. Otpor also made sure to be loud when celebrating the victories. And the victories they chose for themselves. For example, activists might announce a goal of launching 10 new chapters. Whether it took weeks or months to accomplish this, they would then make a major show of having met their goal once it happened. Because they set this target themselves, they could be and they were confident that it was attainable. And once it was attained, they again made certain that everybody knew about it. A key element of this approach was that activists stayed in the driver's seat. Otpor also showed how to frame a victory in individual protest actions. For example, how do you avoid declaring a march of 1 million if you're not sure this many people would show up? Well, Otpor taught us that your action scenario itself can then become the center of your narrative. Good example would be Otpor's blocking a highway action. They were able to prove it with photos for the media, but the blocking itself happened outside rush hours and lasted for as long as they took media photos. Otpor did not wait for its opponents to respond. Instead, it clearly announced their own campaign objectives and then declared victory when these were met. In the end, Otpor played an important role in rallying people around the prospect of a stolen election, joining with other civil society groups in an effort that ultimately drove Milosevic from power. Otpor is an example of the success that a hybrid structure of organization building and mass protest can achieve when it finds synthesis. The transactional view of politics uses institutional power and targets specific power brokers to grant concessions, and that leads to generating social change. An example of such a transactional process would be the push for same-sex marriage in the USA. It is a powerful example of what happens when a politically toxic issue becomes a mainstream crusade. In this case, we have witnessed judges and politicians almost suddenly embracing a cause that was long considered marginal and doomed. If we look more deeply, many of the early efforts like court wins or the mayor of San Francisco opting for civil disobedience and marrying same-sex couple despite of the California state law, so these early efforts were actually failures. Some legal progress was reversed by state legislation, and the wins that did hold prompted backlash in other places. But in the end, their symbolic value was immense. Also, activists worked to turn the power of a wide range of social institutions against the conservative status quo. Here we can think of the role that the actress Ellen DeGeneres played within the entertainment industry. Religious Protestant institutions where the number of welcoming congregations gradually expanded, progressive lawyers, research, events, organized youth groups within education system. When state-by-state wins did materialize, Many were the result of intensive grassroots mobilization. The movement painstakingly compiled a database of all same-sex couples who had married. Promotion of marriage equality went far beyond LGBT advocacy groups. They included professional athletes, libertarian think tanks, and also corporations such as Google or Nike. So when we talk about how to use transactional politics, we should know that progress comes through steady accumulation of small victories, sometimes very, very small. On the other hand, transformational change often occurs in more dramatic cycles. One of such examples would be Gandhi's Salt March. Since 1882, Salt Act gave the British a monopoly on the collection and manufacture of salt in India, limiting its handling to government salt depots and charging a salt tax. Though salt was freely available to those living on the coast, Indians were forced to purchase it from the government, and any violation of the Salt Act was a criminal offense. Gandhi was able to recognize the symbolic strength of salt, and he said, "Next to air and water, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life." Still though, these laws were a minor concern at best, compared with the larger, actually huge goal of the independence movement, which was to ensure the British would leave India. It seemed unreasonable that Gandhi would give so much attention to a cause that seemed very trivial. But Gandhi had not made the choice lightly. It turned out that his choice of salt as a basis for a campaign was one of the weirdest and also most brilliant political challenges of modern times. It was brilliant because defiance of the salt laws was loaded with symbolic significance. Salt was a simple commodity that everyone was compelled to buy and which the government taxed. The fact that Indians were not permitted to freely collect salt from natural deposits or to pan for it from the sea was a clear illustration of how a foreign power was unjustly profiting from the subcontinent's people and its resources. It was a textbook moral injury. The 24-day march in 1930 gained worldwide attention, which gave impetus to the Indian independence movement and started the nationwide civil disobedience movement. Only 78 people began the march with Gandhi, who intended to walk almost 400 kilometers to the coastal village of Dundee. Along the way, growing numbers of Indians were inspired to join Gandhi. When Gandhi broke the salt laws at 6:30 a.m. on the 6th of April 1930, it sparked large-scale acts of civil disobedience against the British salt laws by millions of Indians. The campaign achieved impressive scale. Throughout the country, huge numbers of dissidents began panning for salt and mining natural deposits. Buying illegal packets of the mineral, even if they were of poor quality, became a badge of honor for millions. Soon, the defiance expanded to incorporate local grievances and to take on additional acts of non-cooperation. Gandhi was soon to be arrested, which was planned, but the movement he sparked continued for almost a year, ending with Gandhi's release from jail and even negotiations with Viceroy Lord Irvine. The campaign had a significant effect on changing both worlds and British attitudes towards Indian sovereignty and self-rule, and caused large numbers of Indians to join the fight for the first time. So this was the third story. And what are the lessons? The lessons are that our larger social world or our society must always be a starting place and a touchstone for the actions. We have to meet people where they're at. At the same time, underdog groups have to resist the tendency of insularity and self-enclosure, which is something that we can clearly see in the radical left today. Any movement that attempts to attract only individuals as individuals, one at a time, will never grow fast enough to effect big systemic change. powerful political challengers have never built their operations entirely from scratch, but rather by means of politicizing, activating and aligning existing social blocs and institutions. Participation in the civil rights movement, for example, was hardly an individual matter. It tended to arise in relation to already established membership in communities and institutions, membership in churches, colleges and other social groups. This is the basic formula for how movements gain the kind of leverage they need to contend politically. The spheres of everyday life are certainly not easy to engage politically, let alone to organize into a political force. However, the slow work of transforming everyday spaces is the essence of grassroots political organizing. When we do not contest the cultures, beliefs, symbols, narratives and common sense of and from within the existing institutions and social networks that we are part of, we also walk away from the resources and latent power embedded within them. This is not a winning strategy because in exchange for our own little activist clubhouse, we give away the farm. And let's not forget, we then let our opponents have everything. Just look at the rise and fall of the Occupy movement. Its resistance to uniting with existing groups, social blocs, and institutions that were key to expansion meant that Occupy movement ultimately sabotaged itself. Because once a moment of the whirlwind passes, activists must be attentive to how the gains they have won can be institutionalized and made durable. And here, the habits of structure-based organizing become very useful. We need to be concerned with political outcomes, so not only the aesthetics and the truth. We often seem more preoccupied with the purity of our political expression than with how to move from point A to point B, as if having the right line about everything was more important than making measurable progress on anything. If you are involved in the left-wing groups, you will know this problem very, very well, like I do. We need to be aware of the rising niche called activism. Activism is a surprisingly new word and a new social category. It is tempting to look back at past movements like the abolitionists, suffragettes, or union movement and think of the participants as activists, but the word activism and activists did not even exist during the time of these movements. Today, even people sympathetic with their issue seem to view activism as a phase that college students pass through before they grow up. So let us think about it. We also need to recognize and acknowledge who represent the majority and who we are representing. Are we representing majority? I don't know. We also need to strengthen connections of civics institutions and the populations they serve. How can advocates, helpers, organizers and rebels strengthen their solidarity impact? For example, one of the organizers brainstormed some possible moves. Advocates could persuade cities and states to give driver's license to undocumented people. Organizers create circles of solidarity in which citizens could physically intervene when immigrants are in danger and surround the vulnerable ones. Helpers could insist that they provide food and health care to people in deportation centers, and if entry is refused, collaborate with rebels to break in with food and risk arrest if they can afford that. We should also play offense, not defense. This is also very important. As Gandhi showed us, no one wins anything on consequence of the defensive trying to maintain previous gains. US movements in the 1980s made gains in the previous 2 decades. Understandably, they tried to defend them. As Gandhi would predict, the movements instead lost ground to the Reagan Revolution and for the most part have lost ground ever since, except for one, the LGBT movement. This movement did not defend. LGBT people escalated in the 1980s with ACT UP leading the way. They followed up with the campaign for equal marriage and escalated again with the demand for equality in the military. LGBT people proved that Gandhi was right. The best defense is an offense. Today, many American progressives unconsciously talking about Trump defensively, preparing to make precisely the same mistake as older generations did with Reagan. The LGBT lesson is obvious. Heighten nonviolent direct action campaigns and start new ones. A direct action campaign is defined by a pressing issue, a clear demand, and a target that can yield that demand. Powerful social movements have often built in exactly this way. These days, campaign design needs to take account of the recent impact of social media as well, because many people have allowed social media to draw them into an isolating bubble. Activists need to design campaigns that deliberately increase their base through building relationships beyond the choir. Increased use of training may be necessary to maximize impact. Next, link campaigns to build movements, then link movements to create a movement of movements. Social movements can take stands and campaign for issues that have transformative impact, such as women's right to vote, LGBT rights, or stopping pipelines, which is probably one of the big actions that we have seen. Next, avoid one-off actions because they just suck your energy. Protests, this is maybe also self-critical, protests are by nature reactive. Progressives, often led by people with a track record of loss, take the bait and react over and over. Simple protests, no matter what the issue, essentially signal to those who rule that they are winning. They have manipulated us into reacting. Reactivity is a habit among many activists and may take heroic self-discipline to avoid. Aim to unite around a vision for justice, equality and freedom. As feminists, for example, we can surely explore the possible connections with ecological movement. Next, make the vision more real by extending it to new economy and to co-ops, because whatever is the world we want to build, it has to rely on some kind of economy. Let's start building it. See polarization as your opportunity, for example, against the right wing. Next, do not make your own cause toxic by scaring each other. You may also ask yourself, what role were you born to play in this process of social change? According to Moya, there are 4 roles. Let us name them now. The advocate focuses on communication with what Moore called the power holders, those who can change a policy or practice. The advocate is the reformer. The way you can scan that, for example, is inviting people in the workshops that you prepare, to recall from their childhood whether they usually turned to an authority to correct what they felt was an injustice or problem. Maybe they went to the teacher after class to report bullying on the playground or told a parent that the little sister was upset. Many adults who prefer to play the advocate role in social movements express that preference early, often developing some skill and confidence. Next, the helper. The helper is drawn to direct service, personally doing what they can do to remedy the situation. They address discrimination in jobs by teaching how to write resumes and initiating job training. They attack carbon pollution by starting solar installation co-ops. Because much of mainstream community life is marked by service, Moore's name for this role is citizen. When adults known for playing helper roles look back on their childhood, they sometimes remember their own intervention to stop the bully, or their being the first one to bring a band-aid when little brother falls off the bike. The third role is the organizer's role. The organizing part may not be most satisfying for the advocate and the helper. The organizer, on the other hand, experiences joy from collecting people who may not even know each other and turning them into a well-oiled team, or tripling the attendance at the union's local monthly meetings. Organizers often believe that the sheer power of numbers will make change because power holders are afraid of alternative sources of power and may concede something to head off further growth. When organizers were children, they may have been the ones who revived the celebration of an important day at school or boosted the flagging morale of the drill team. Moore calls them change agents. The rebel, who sees a problem or injustice, prefers to make a commotion of some kind to force power holders to make a change. Martin Luther King explained that a campaign must create a crisis. Gandhi made so much trouble that he made India ungovernable by the British. True, some famous rebels needed organizing skills to scale up their commotion to the crisis point. But rebels look at numbers not for their own sake, but to determine how many people will it take to create what degree of crisis. Alice Paul left the mass movement for women's suffrage in order to lead a smaller band of rebels willing to make the non-violent trouble that forced US President Wilson to give in to justice. If you are trying to build a successful social movement, you must include these 4 roles. Also, do not forget that these roles, however positive, they can also have a negative side, and try to avoid it. In this webinar, we looked at historic actions, very colorful and creating momentum from a wide spectrum of possibilities. We also learned that however colorful, these actions were never random. We saw that actions that are obsessed with their own purity will not succeed in building a momentum, like the Occupy movement. We saw that actions can also be playful, as in the case of Otpor. But as feminists, we should at all times be aware of the ubiquitous presence of the so-called dominant narrative. To illustrate it, as well to conclude my talk, I'm going to share with you the hidden story of Anna O. Students of psychology are often familiar with this story. Anna O, whose real name was Berta Pappenheim, was a patient of Josef Breuer, a close colleague of Sigmund Freud. Her treatment provided the foundation for psychoanalytic interventions and eventually psychoanalytic theory. Her case study was published in Studies in Hysteria, a collaborative effort between Breuer and Freud. But rather than a passive patient merely receiving treatment, Berta Pappenheim took an active role in shaping it. However, this part of the story is usually either downplayed or ignored. When she decided the primary Breuer's intervention, which was hypnosis, wasn't working to her satisfaction, Pappenheim suggested she instead talk through her problems, saying whatever was on her mind. The terms she used were chimney sweeping and talking cure, but just as her initiative has been downplayed, her language has been mostly ignored. Today, we know these interventions as free association and psychoanalysis. Although she did receive some relief from the treatment, overall, she did not get any better. In many ways, she got worse. Breuer and Pappenheim spent way too much time together, and eventually Breuer abandoned her, abruptly terminating therapy and recommending her hospitalization. This is where usually this story ends, with a shake of the head at the tragedy that Anna O was just too ill to be cured, despite having such brilliant male minds on her case. Occasionally there is a mention of her eventual recovery, though we never get to know more about it. Perhaps we are meant to assume that the psychoanalysis eventually helped her. But the true story goes like this, and I'm quoting. After Breuer abandoned her, she apparently remained ill for several years, and then she recovered. She found her voice and her sanity in the women's liberation movement. Under a pseudonym, Paul Berthold, she translated into German the classic treatise by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and authored a play, Women's Right. Under her own name, Berta Pappenheim became a prominent feminist social worker, intellectual, and an organizer. End of quote. It turns out that Berta has a cousin in Kreuzlingen where she was hospitalized. The cousin's name was Anna Ettlinger, and she was a women's rights activist. She advocated for women through her writing. She organized a ladies' literature course, and she founded a girls' high school. She encouraged Berta in her own writing, helped her take a nursing course, and influenced her own pro-woman politics. Berta's visit with her cousin Anna took place during her hospitalization, and her health improved enough to be discharged. Once we know the rest of the story, it becomes clear there was nothing mysterious or confusing about her recovery. Berta Poppin Heim found her recovery, freedom, voice and sanity in feminism. Women try so many promised cures when experiencing this distress, and we often receive temporary relief, but it does not actually work. We try massage, medication, prayer, visualization, meditation, church, temple, synagogue, yoga, psychotherapy, diet, exercise, herbal teas, spa days, spiritual direction, acupuncture, retreats, self-help books, girls' nights out, women's empowerment groups, personal growth, workshop, you name it. And though it has soothed us for the moment, providing temporary relief, it never ultimately solved our problems. We never found real recovery because, like psychoanalysis for Anna O, all of these things alleviate symptoms, but none of them are the cure. But for some lucky few of us, someone speaks truth in our lives. It may be a family member, it may be a cousin, feminist author, blogger, mentor, social worker. We encounter a woman who speaks bold and uncompromising words of truth, and it reverberates in every cell of our body. What Freud and Breuer failed to realize is that the context of this telling matters. When it is told in the context of patriarchy, it will do all it can to shut it down before it gathers power to go anywhere. But this truth-telling, this naming, in the right feminist context can pick up steam and carry us to real recovery. In the course of a long and fruitful career, Berta Poppin Heim directed an orphanage for girls, founded a feminist organization for Jewish women, and traveled throughout Europe and the Middle East to campaign against the sexual exploitation of women and children. Her dedication, energy, and commitment were legendary. In the words of a colleague, a volcano lived in this woman. Her fight against the abuse of women and children was almost a physically felt pain in her. In her will, Berta expressed the wish that those who visit her grave in Frankfurt would leave a small stone as a quiet promise to serve the mission of women's duties and women's joy unflinchingly and courageously. Thank you for your attention.
We would like to begin our question and discussion part now. We will start by answering any questions that were written down in the question pane, if there are any. And if you would like to ask any other questions, you could now raise your electronic hand and we will unmute you eventually. We'll let you know. But first, let's start with any questions. Okay. The questions pane is empty. Now I'm checking for, I see one electronic hand raised. All right, Haliki, I'm going to unmute you and I'm giving the microphone back to Kat so she can answer the question.
Okay, you are now in unmute. Haliki? We don't seem to be. What is her? Unmuted? No.
Hello?
No. You are now unmuted, Haliki.
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I'm here calling you from Brussels, currently in the European Commission Gender Equality Unit. And I just wanted to hear some more of your thoughts really on applying what you've been discussing to the fight to end violence against women. So I guess I have a two-part question. Firstly, would you say that that there is a movement to end violence against women? Would you describe it as to what extent would you say that it's similar to a social movement or not? And if we can say that there is a movement to end violence against women, or at least lots of organizations are working on that, and lots of individuals, then what are your thoughts on how some of these lessons learned could be applied to this particular issue of violence against women, which of course is linked to many other, all other gender equality and women's rights issues?
Okay, thank you for the question. Very interesting. I hope I will know how to answer them. I think we are striving to have a movement, but I'm not sure that this movement has succeeded in building enough power yet.
Mm-hmm.
This is why this topic interested me as well, because this is I guess this is something that that we should definitely build our capacities in. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
And so let's say that we how like in terms of these lessons learned, do you have any thoughts on kind of specific ones for, if we were to build up the movement more strongly, then how we could use some of these lessons learned for the implementation?
Okay, I think we should first be very frank and open with our failures. So I think this is a starting point. Just realize what our weaknesses are, and also what our strengths are, and then just trying to build from there on, because otherwise I don't think it would go very far. I think that there are things that we should be more aware of about where we are weak. I don't want to say we're wrong. It's just there are points where what we're trying to build is weak. Like maybe we are, maybe we just opt for transformational transformations, like slow building momentum, and just being nice to the governments, and as we see, we don't necessarily have to be nice to achieve things. So this is just a thought. I would have to think about it more, and it definitely depends. It's a case-to-case thing, but we as WAVE, as a European network, should definitely help members to to engage even more into that.
Thank you very much. Am I allowed a very quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I'm just very interested because you mentioned WAVE as one of the kind of potential support mechanisms, I guess, for building up the strength of the movement in different countries. Because I just realized that the examples you gave of social movements, unless I remembering correctly, they were all nationally based. I mean, of course, for example, the movement to achieve same-sex marriage, has been to some extent replicated elsewhere. But does the theory, or does your, what are your thoughts on? Is it actually possible to have an international social movement with a lot of power, kind of like at the same time simultaneously happening?
Well, I think we should strive to build it, because in a way, yes, we definitely should remain on national level, but yes, I think in some ways the international movement will be needed.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question, and I'm going to read it because it's written. by Nicoletta. Hi, she says, did Otpor movement have the 4 roles that you mentioned? Since when does this organization exist, and does it exist today? How sustainable it is? How did they raise the money for their activities and training? Did they have a strategist? Well, I must say that this organization does not exist anymore, and this is probably this would be a critique, or maybe maybe not even the critique. They actually what they wanted to do was a political change, and they did that, and then they disappeared. And that does not mean that that everything after that was good. Of course, it's not. So it did not succeed in being sustainable very much. If they had these 4 roles, I think they had all 4 roles. I don't know how aware were they of these roles. It's just it's just the reason I mentioned the roles was for you to think about how to achieve more, how to find what's good in people, what's something that you can make sense of and build upon their qualities. So the Otpor movement existed in the 1990s, and as far as I know today it does not exist anymore. So no, it was not in that sense, it was not sustainable. How did they raise money for their activities and training? Well, from what I know is that they made things very low cost. So so the brilliance that they had was that their logo was very easy to replicate, so everybody could do it, and they based their actions on volunteers. Did they have a strategist? I don't think that was a single person. I think that was a group of people. I hope this answers your questions. Okay, cool. These are the questions. Do we have any other hand? If you still want to raise hands, please do. And if you don't, I'm gonna give the microphone back to Lena. And thank you very much for attention. Of course, we are reachable through the email, so if any further questions appear, just let us know and we can discuss that in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. So thank you very much for your time, for your sharing of experiences, and for the discussion. We hope that the exchange of information was helpful for your work as well. I will be sending out a Dropbox link with a folder containing an edited video of the webinar and the PowerPoint presentation by the end of next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the Thursday, and we are going to go ahead and sign off now. Have a nice day.